So I saw an article that the LA let's start. I'm going to start that over.
You can.
So I saw an article that the LA Times posted that was talking about not knowing the true danger of the Omicron variant of the coronavirus, and not to necessarily do a lot of digging into the virus itself. Part of what it presented outlined a concept that we've talked about a few times in a way that I don't know that I would have thought about it before. And that concept being just a general scientific mindset in the approach to anything and everything. And I figure I'll give kind of the highlights from what the article's describing, and then kind of explain what prompted the kind of the thought of wanting to talk about the scientific mindset as a result. So in the article, it mentions that back in December, South Africa was taking stock of the first surge fueled by the Omicron variant, and health experts were pleasantly surprised by the trends they were seeing. The risk of hospitalization among infected adults was lower by significant margin, lower chances of being admitted to the ICU, and death rates were still falling. What this was fueling from the article's perspective is that now we're in a situation where experts and policymakers and leaders and just everybody in general is trying to kind of figure out whether we stop taking certain precautions, or for the most part in the United States, I think most areas have stopped taking precautions other than some basics here and there. Or at least that seems to be the reality in the Southeast, I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But the inconvenient truth of the matter is that we actually don't know for sure that Omicron is more mild than its predecessors. We stated that it is, and you and I have even talked about how you expect as a virus becomes more infectious, it's typically less
virulent,
deadly. Yeah, very true. But this article mentioned that Omicron came onto the scene at a time when vaccines were a thing, and there was a certain significant percentage of the population that was vaccinated or had some level of immunity from previous infections. There were treatments available that had not been in existence during previous waves. And so it posed the very specific question of, if Delta had arrived under those same conditions, would it have appeared the same way? And I liked that thought of a question because it perfectly encapsulates the thing that we've kind of abstractly talked about with regard to being a better person and trying to take and process information in real time as we've learned more about different things and make better choices, more informed choices. All hallmarks of what we've termed this scientific mindset. But here was a very specific and tangible what if that could also be used to help illustrate it. And that's what prompted the thought to use that as a topic for this evening.
Yeah, I find it interesting, and I've seen other articles and other places that talk about this. Like, there were so many things where it's like, hey, the not the infection rate, but the hospitalization rate is going down, and we have no idea why. And it's not as clear cut as, like, generally speaking, virulent virus becomes more contagious and less virulent because of if you kill all of your hosts, then you can no longer evolve and exist. So that's the big thing that we the trend that we see often with all sicknesses and so forth, if they're not already just contagious and not and non-lethal. But I remember it was a New York Times article that I was reading that was just discussing, like, there's so many things that we know. We see these trends, but we have no idea why We don't actually know why it's occurring this way.
And one of the things that I find interesting about that personally is that doesn't trigger a level of unease to me that it would trigger in other people who have a more, I'm going to say rigid mindset, just trying to give a contrast instead of trying to label a specific way of thinking.
I just thought of anecdotally, I thought about this old Mississippi man who was like, we can land a man on we can put a man on the moon, but we can't land a plane in a thunderstorm.
Yeah, similar enough, right? I mean, it's a good way to kind of give that contrast. This idea of the scientific mindset that we've talked about, I've also often thought it might be somewhat generational in nature, a willingness to accept that there's a certain level of unknown in everything that we know that is found easier among those individuals who had to deal with fairly consistent change over the course of the formative years, where things were very different from one year to the next anyway. And we can use plenty of different examples, but for purposes of illustration, just the changes in media formats would be a good way to think about it. You just get to a point where you build up a cassette collection and then have to change to CDs and then have to change to digital music, and it continued to evolve over time. And it was a pain. It was frustrating, but having to constantly adapt to the new, not necessarily the new big thing, but the new standard thing.
Or even just, this is the direction the technology is going. To use something before our time, Betamax versus VHS. Betamax was clearly the better product, but that's not where the industry went.
Right. And I don't know how much of that is me thinking it attributes to a level of comfort with the how I termed a certain level of not knowing, even though what we think we know is known, right? This acceptance of, with what we've termed the scientific mindset, being, I could always know more, or at some point I will know more. Like there will be additional input, maybe in an hour, maybe in a year, maybe in a decade, that's going to fundamentally in some way alter my understanding of this thing, and being perfectly okay with that.
Yeah, like I think our whole society has, whether you approved of it or whether a person has approved of it or not, our whole society has moved into a place of there's a mountain of information, and some amount of time that could be as short as an hour later, there's a brand new mountain of information. And it's not that the other mountain of information is wrong. It's just that this new information might be more accurate, more specific. So, it's I feel like from our generation forward, we grew up with that sort of shift. We grew up with the analog to digital shift, and that's not been seen in any previous generation, and I don't expect to see it in any future generation, perhaps in our lifetime. But generations that came after ours are living in the just the voluminous amount of information we have.
And kind of along the same lines, part of what also makes me feel like there's a fairly strong generational component to this mindset idea is that if you look at the way groups of people pull, or pull maybe isn't quite the right word, the way they weigh and digest and bring information into a level of understanding to to become a part of their known set of data, right? So whether that changes your mindset or at all or not, being irrelevant, it's just the recognition of that additional input. The willingness to see those different ones and to some extent at least try to interpret either the meaning or perception behind them. Maybe at the end of the day you consider it to be, wacky or not trustworthy or whatever, and so you discard it entirely. But there's a willingness to at least look at that information and see whether it changes your perception or mindset. That just doesn't feel like it exists as strongly, if at all, in previous generations, and feels kind of like it's being lost as we get further away into younger generations, or the subsequent generations.
Right. Older generations aren't. It's a common trend. And I don't. We're talking about entire huge swaths of people, but like older
we're being
generations,
very stereotypical.
The stereotypes exist for a reason, but we are painting with very large brushes. I mean, this is not a canvas. This is we're painting the wall. So we're trying to put together a mural, but the generations that came before ours just reject. It's not even reject. They don't accept that there's this additional information. It's like, no, that's not a thing. That's what you're telling me is just not a thing. My mind went to sex and gender, and it's like older generation. Are you trying to tell me that there's more than one, more than two genders or more than two sexes? And I'm like, yeah, and it's like, no, that's not even a thing. Whereas, you might have people in our generation and younger generations that will say, oh yeah, I recognize what you're talking about, but I reject all of it. That's a step further along than there is no additional information. Accepting that it exists and rejecting it is slightly.
But I agree. And it seems like there's more of I understand what you're saying, or I recognize that you're talking about this thing, and it's a lot of times not even just rejection. It's more, I don't understand it. It doesn't directly affect me. Mm-hmm. You do what you want to do with that information, and I'm going to continue to respond or work with those things that make sense to me. Like it's a level of rejection, but it's not intended to be, I think, is what I'm trying to explain it as. Right or wrong, that's not part of the equation here. For what I'm talking about, what I'm talking about is the difference between actively rejecting someone's position and saying, I just don't get it, but okay, right? And that feels like that's far more prevalent of a response than just outright rejection. And it may also be tied to social circles. I'm not entirely sure. Very anecdotal evidence on that one. But you take that kind of understanding and you look at exposure to younger generations, and a lot of them just kind of accept that whatever you're saying is some other level of something that maybe they know or don't know. But to me, there's more of all right, great, you say whatever you want to say, but I don't need to understand it or know anything about it kind of thing. Like there's a lack of trying to understand, or at least trying to acknowledge that it's actually a recognized thing, if that makes sense.
I think some of them. I think there's going to be. We'll see. Large parts of that generation take it even a step further. Like there's some Gen Z kids that are like, yeah, there's 16 genders, and I'm not identifying as any of them, and I'm in a couple with 3 other people.
Yeah, I guess the way I was trying to say it, that I don't know if I have a better way to say it, is that you get into the younger generations, or younger than us at least, and there's just I don't care.
Yes.
Not an I don't care. It's irrelevant if it's 5 or 30.
Right.
There are just these things that are what they are.
Right. Well, there's 5 today. There'll be 30 tomorrow and 100 in a month.
And the contrast I was attempting to make was that there's no seeming desire to understand it. It's just acceptance.
Yes.
Where, at least for those that are more in my generational age group circle, there's at least a desire to try to understand it. And then there's a decision based on whether it's understood or not, how to incorporate that into perceptions or philosophies or thoughts.
I'm nodding my head, yes.
Okay. I can't hear that on the mic.
I know. That's why I had to.
Now, that curiosity component, that to me is a critical part of maintaining this idea of the scientific mindset. And that's where I'm concerned that that way of thinking could potentially become lost again as a result. And it's not necessarily a direct correlation, because you could say, all right, maybe it's not put into place on gender conversations, for example, but maybe the younger generations are far more curious and inquisitive about how certain physical things work, or like mechanical engineering, whatever. Like the mindset could exist and just not be applied in different spheres. I get that as well. It just feels concerning to not see the same level of curiosity and drive attempting to understand things and just saying, okay, sure.
I think that those with the scientific mindset might be a little bit, well, maybe it doesn't change as time goes on. I think that, the difference that you might see here is there are broader fields for somebody who has that kind of mindset to utilize that sort of thinking than there was 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So I don't necessarily think that again, this is unknown, but I don't know that we're going to find that there are more people now in future generations that have this mindset. It's just that we are cultivating it better than we were, or cultivating it better than we were able to or knew to in previous generations. Because the whole, hey, there's new information, but who cares? It exists in previous generations, but it's, instead of it being there's new information, who cares? It's like, that's not real information. I don't accept that there's new information. The shift has gone to, it's like, yeah, great, new information, don't care.
That's a fairly, well, I want to say that's a fairly succinct way to put it, but think about, using us as an example. There's a very recognizable understanding of there's new information and I need to know what to do with it as an action. That it doesn't matter what kind of information it is, what field it is. I am aware of this new information and it needs to influence my view in some way, or I need to reject it. There's some action that needs to be taken. There's new information and it doesn't matter should be a step backwards from that, shouldn't it?
I think it is a bit of a regression.
Okay,
it's not.
The whole reason I mention that is because if you look at the generations we are raising, there's an emphasis on that mindset as well for it to kind of be a resurgence, correct?
Yeah, I think
is that kind of how we're talking about future generations?
Right. So there would be the generation after, our children are the generation after Generation Z, and that's Gen Alpha.
Okay.
So the Alpha kids are going to they'll probably have a stronger scientific mindset.
Okay. Then I'm on board with the description and the way it was presented. My only piece of concern was saying that or interpreting it that there's new information and it doesn't really matter or who cares was on par or a step further when to me it was a regression. And I was just making sure we were on the same page with that part.
Yeah. It's a regression as far as like considering the scientific mindset. It's not. It's
not necessarily a regression for social progress.
Yes. Right, and the I don't care is just along the lines of yes, of course there's information out there that I don't care about. It's because there's just so much of it.
Yeah, and I think the biggest hurdle is trying to describe these things abstract enough and generic enough to not specifically say, hey, this group of people exactly, and make it sound more like it's a very rigid thing, because it's not. You can have very inquisitive, very open-minded people that are in their 80s today, or in their teens. It's not specifically a generational thing, but it does seem that there are large consistencies within the majority of generational divides.
Right, we see trends in our generations. So it's and I think this is also why our parents' generation has been so susceptible to fake news, actual fake news, and misinformation.
Yeah, I certainly agree on that front, because it initially came by way of a legitimate news source.
Right.
Or seemingly legitimate news source.
Well, and there's just so much misinformation is just there to reinforce what you already believed. And it doesn't challenge the status quo. The misinformation allows you to stagnate in your thinking.
And to take it a step further, the piece that a lot of times isn't emphasized is that even if the misinformation is combated by legitimate information, even overwhelmingly so, because of the sheer volume of being able to stand up and repeat something as though it comes from a different source over and over and over and over, means that you could feel like there's only or there's a much greater emphasis on this misinformation than really exists, because it looks like it's been corroborated by multiple places, even though if you start to follow the breadcrumbs, if you will, it all points to one source.
It's the same reason why old folks are susceptible to phishing schemes from Nigerian princes.
We've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty.
I don't get that one though. Yeah, it's. I was recently watching the TikTok videos, and I saw a conversation between two people, and one person said, "Okay." One person made a claim. The other person said, "I reject your claim." And the person that said, "Okay, well, I can demonstrate this claim." The claim was that a bowling ball and a tennis ball, when released at the same time, will travel at the same rate and hit the ground at the same time. And that other person rejected that premise, or that hypothesis. And so it's like, hey, cool, it's easy to demonstrate, and we can prove it. And the guy responded with, well, as soon as you show me, like, you dropping a bowling ball and a tennis ball, I'll know that if it supports what you're claiming, I'll know that it's fake. So it already, like, it doesn't matter. Like, the details and the proof don't matter. Like, the explanation doesn't matter for people who are rejecting that there can be new information in the world, because they've already, when you have that mindset, you're automatically decided that if something, changes, challenges my thinking, I'm going to reject it because it's not real, it's fake.
In another way of putting that, just for contrast of the way that we've identified, components of the scientific mindset, it's a very closed-minded approach to anything. It does bring up a point that is curious that I don't have a good answer for. I don't know that anybody really has a good answer for. But when did we reach this point where you could just reject something that could be demonstrated? I mean, it's one of those things where, all right, I can make a case for rejecting an abstract concept or something that has to be followed theoretically for proof. Sure, there's a certain amount of wiggle room for saying, well, I don't agree here, and you don't have a good, solid way to demonstrate, factually that, yes, it's true or not. But using the bowling ball and tennis ball example, telling the other person to go get their own bowling ball and tennis ball, and you could demonstrate it for them. I mean, there are ways to negate this idea of rejection, but yet this group of people still finds it to be a legitimate response to just outright reject it, even in the face of demonstrable evidence.
See, what I think is it's all the bowling balls and it's all the tennis balls. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.